Welcome back to Courtroom Communication Skills. This is program 2 called Channeling Your Adrenaline. By the end of this program, you'll understand how you can transform your performance anxiety into excitement, how to psych yourself up and not out.
You'll learn specifically how to channel your adrenaline rush into dynamic, persuasive delivery in the courtroom.
You'll understand how you can appear at ease and in control of yourself and the courtroom, regardless of how you feel inside. We've talked about how action can make you feel more natural and relaxed. Now, in this program, we're going to talk very specifically about your body and how it behaves in the courtroom. The very first topic we're going to cover is not necessarily a body part, but a hormone. And that hormone is adrenaline. Whenever we stand to speak, we get an adrenaline rush. We really can't control it. And sometimes we get a big adrenaline rush and sometimes a little adrenaline rush. It's very hard to predict exactly how it's going to unfold. It happens to us without our knowing it and without our controlling it because it's an automatic response to stress. It's an automatic response to emotion. What is an adrenaline rush anyway? It happens to us when our adrenal glands, which are back here, far away from our brains, sense that there's some kind of stress around us. When we're standing up in court, we can understand what that stress is. But it really started to happen to us eons ago. It's an evolutionary response to an emergency. If I were standing here and out from behind that camera suddenly came a saber-toothed tiger, I would have a huge adrenaline rush, just as my ancestors would have. And I would be infused with energy. What adrenaline does is it fills our large muscles with lots of blood flow. It's the emergency response hormone that gives us the strength to fight or to flee, to run out of the room as the saber-toothed tiger comes towards me. It gives me superhuman strength sometimes, but it also has collateral effects on my physiology that I have to cope with. Now, in a real emergency, like the saber-toothed tiger stalking me down the hallways here, I could run away and I would only be focused on the emergency. In the courtroom, when we stand to say, "May it please the court," and we get an adrenaline rush, we're suddenly multitasking. We're dealing with the adrenaline that's happening to us and staying focused on the task at hand. What's our client's problem and how are we going to solve it right here in this courtroom? So let's think, what's happening to us when we get an adrenaline rush? Our heart rate increases. That sends our blood pressure higher. Our pupils dilate and then they get small, making it hard to read sometimes at the beginnings of presentations. The hair on our arms stands on end. Our digestion actually stops. Our body stops digesting in order to divert resources into the large muscles of our body, again, so we can fight or flee. We're in the midst of a fight or flight response, just as we have to collect ourselves to answer a question from the judge, or give an opening statement, or examine a witness. All this time, we may be controlling an adrenaline response that we're having to the atmosphere around us, to the courtroom. And it's, again, difficult to predict because it's an emotional reaction. So our emotions are taking over our body, and it's very distracting. That's why we talk about adrenaline for such a long time when we're discussing bodies. One of adrenaline's most annoying side effects is that by sending a lot of blood flow into the large muscles of our body, the ones that allow us to fight or flee, that sends a lot of blood flow into our extremities so that our fingers sometimes shake in court. Believe me, I've seen fingers tremble in lots of courtrooms where you might not expect it. It's not just anxiety, it's excitement. So we're looking for techniques in this program to channel that excitement of adrenaline. It can be quite distracting to realize that your fingers are trembling in front of a jury, and you need ways to offload that adrenaline and let it flow away. It does tend to subside after an initial burst, so there are ways to offload adrenaline's effects. And again, adrenaline can be distracting, but it's not all bad. I've focused on some of its physiological effects here because I want you to be prepared for them. We have to be able to override them and get around them. But it can also make us excited, happy to be in court, happy to finally arrive at that moment when you can fight for your client. It can keep us awake and keep us alert. We know from people who engage in excitement sports, thrill sports, rock climbing, skydiving, surfing. Name your own thrill sport if you still have time to practice it. But that exciting feeling is something that we also want to bring into the courtroom. Excitement can make you argue better. So balance the little bit of anxiety you may feel, or a lot, with knowing that you can also use adrenaline to get yourself pumped up, to psych yourself up and not out. Adrenaline is also your friend in spite of being a pretty high maintenance one.
Adrenaline targets specific muscle groups, arms for fight, legs for flight. So to get control of these big muscles of the body, we need to give a specific instruction that will make the way that you are standing the foundation of everything that rises above it. In this case, we're going to tell the legs, plant your feet and stand still. Because if you don't, the legs have a kind of action or mind of their own. Have you ever stood in front of an audience or in front of a court and had your legs shake, your knees knock, that wonga 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 feeling? What is that? Well, of course, it's adrenaline. It's adrenaline saying to those leg muscles, we're ready to run, we're ready to flee. And the reason we shake in the legs or breath or arms is because every muscle in the body is paired with another muscle. When they both get energized, they pull against each other. That's the shakes. So we need to get some control over that primal, almost animalistic response to fight or flight. So we're going to plant the feet and stand still, but in a very specific way. So you might even stand up right now listening to this and do this with me, because it will be more useful to feel this on your body than to just watch me demonstrate it. Let's reject those stances that do not work. Stand as I am with my feet so close together that my shoes are touching, and notice, of course, that that's too narrow. I neither feel nor look very strong because I'm in this very narrow stance. Let's not do that. Do the opposite, a stance that's very wide. Kind of the gunslinger in a Western. Well, that looks goofy in a different way, so we're going to reject that. Let's try the stance that is too casual. If you came and were speaking with me in my kitchen, I might very well stand like this because it's natural, I'm comfortable, I'm relaxed, but it's way too casual for the courtroom. So if that's too casual, and this is too wide, and this is too narrow, just right is this. About shoulder width apart, and a little bit of angle or asymmetry to your feet. In other words, instead of being on exact parallel like downhill skis, to say, well, a little bit of angle with one toe a little ahead of the other makes you look as comfortable as you possibly can. And it's the feeling you would adopt standing in front of a mirror and saying, I think I'll buy this suit. It's that feeling. But you need to have your feet firmly planted. In fact, even wiggle your toes to sense that absolute anchored to this courtroom floor. And think about how many expressions we have in the English language about standing still and credibility and commitment and belief. He would not budge. She would not change her position. We couldn't get him to move. He felt so strongly about it. Well, you want to stand up and take that stance, because the opposite is he beat around the bush and he danced around the issue, and he pussyfooted around, all of which is a very different level of commitment. So, plant your feet and stand still. Let's move up to the knees. Make sure your knees are not locked. In fact, try that. Feel this. Lock your knees back by tightening your thighs and pulling your kneecaps up. Well, that's not what we want. That's too stiff. The opposite of that would be a little crouch, but we're not going to bounce in the courtroom. So somewhere between the bounce and the lock is just right. A feeling of flexibility, as if the knee is floating, the upper leg on the lower leg floating at the knee. So we're not looking for rigidity. We're just trying to avoid repetitive rocking. That feeling we sometimes call subway knees. It's like the strap hanger on public transportation. As the door closes, there's a little flex in that position of the knees to take the impact of the train starts to move. It's that feeling of flexibility. March up a little higher to the hips. The hips need to be centered over the knees and feet. But think how natural it is for many of us, since adolescence, to look cool, that we've stood with our weight off on one side. Now, all my weight is on my right leg. In fact, it's so much on my right leg I can lift my left leg off the ground. Eventually, my right leg will get tired and say, let's shift over to the left, and then back to the right, and back to the left, and that's where the rocking comes from. So instead of being natural and off to one side, again, too casual, to center your hips over your knees over your feet, and plant those feet and stand still. So that's the first instruction. As you walk to that place in the courtroom where you're going to begin, you say to yourself, plant those feet and stand still. Then Newton's law of motion becomes Newton's law of advocacy. A body at rest will tend to remain at rest. A body in motion will tend to remain in motion. You want to be that body at rest. Plant your feet before you begin.
We just learned that all of our large muscles in our bodies are paired, and when we get an adrenaline rush, they tend to tremble because they're pulling on each other. That's true in our thighs, that's true in our arms, and it's true in our diaphragm. Let's think now about breathing and breath and how you can use it in the courtroom to buy yourself time and power your voice. Think about your diaphragm right now. It's one of the largest muscles in our bodies, and it's lying right under your rib cage, right about here, ready to help your voice, ready to give you the thinking power you need, the cognitive firepower you need in the courtroom. If you can get control of your breath, which includes your diaphragm, your rib cage, and your lungs, you'll get three major benefits. You will feel better. You'll feel more natural. You'll speak better. Your best voice will emerge in the courtroom, and you'll think better. How can you get all these benefits simply by mindful breathing, by getting conscious control over the muscles of breathing? Most lawyers don't exploit the power of their breath. A whole bunch of people you're competing against are not thinking about their breath. But in the courtroom, if you can engage some technique over your breathing, you're going to be miles ahead. Why does it make you feel better if you get control of your breath in the courtroom? So let's think about how we breathe when we're on vacation. We take nice, big, deep, slow breaths. So right now, as you're watching this, sit up straight in your chair and sit back against the back of it. Put your feet flat on the floor and straighten yourself up in your chair. I want you to feel your lungs all the way around, and right now, while I'm talking, start to take slow, deliberate breaths. And the first one should be backwards. Breathe back into the back of your chair so that you can feel your lungs and rib cage expanding backwards, back here. When we're on vacation or when you're sitting in that chair, you're relaxed and our breath comes slow. It's deliberate, it's deep. Hear how slow that breath is? That's how we breathe when we're lying on the beach or in a hammock by a river in the summertime, reading a book, just about to maybe have a cup of tea or do something relaxing. When you're relaxed, when you're feeling naturally relaxed, your breath comes very slow. In the courtroom, before you stand to speak, say you're at counsel table, if you say to yourself, take a few deliberate breaths that are nice and slow, no one will see it, and it can start to get your heart rate down, bring your blood pressure down. You're mitigating the effects of adrenaline merely by taking deep, deliberate breaths. So if you get control of your breath, you'll feel better. And it doesn't have to wait till you're at counsel table. It can be walking up the steps to the courtroom or in the elevator. It can be in your car on the way or walking across the parking lot. Deep, deliberate breaths, and take them nice and low. Remember, your rib cage is surrounded by, encrusted with, really, muscles that can pull your ribs apart and allow your lungs to expand outward. So right now, when you're thinking about vacation breaths, take a few breaths that go way out to the side, almost to the sides of the room, and feel how large your lungs are at the bottom. A deep abdominal breath that looks more like this, where everything falls forward, is even more productive. Those are the kinds of breaths that the big noisemakers make. Opera singers, for example. How do they make that huge sound over an orchestra with no amplification? They drop their abdomen and engage their diaphragm. The diaphragm then pushes air out over vocal cords, and that makes the sound. When I said you'll be able to speak better, you can give your voice a more beautiful sound by giving it literally more air. Soft-spoken people tend to speak with less core to their voice, where we hear that beautiful supported round sound. That's the most beautiful part of your voice, and I guarantee you it's there. If you default to being very soft-spoken, we hear mostly air and not beauty. Getting control of your breath while you're speaking gives you a bunch of advantages. First of all, it lets you breathe inside of sentences, even inside of short questions, such as, Mrs. Johnson, where do you live? I took a breath after Mrs. Johnson. Or, before you saw the bus, tell us where you were looking. I took a breath in the middle of that question. Once you've got control of your breath, you can breathe more often as you're speaking and expand the time you can talk. There's no law that says you have to get through a whole sentence in one breath. If you break up your language with breaths in between, you'll simply have a lot more air to say what you want to say. Remember also, if you get control of your breath, you will think better. That's the third excellent benefit from breathing deliberately and consciously. Why will you think better? Because you'll be flooding your brain with oxygen way more often. Lots of studies are telling us now, our brains need about 20% of the oxygen we take in. So from here down, we need 80%. This little bit needs 20%. And when you're standing in the courtroom and you hear objection, hearsay, and you get an adrenaline rush, the first thing to do is take a breath. Fill your brain with oxygen, flood it so those neurons fire and the blood flows. You'll be able to understand and say why this is not a hearsay objection. So you'll get three benefits. You'll feel better, you'll speak better, and you will think better if you get control of your breath at the very beginning. You'll also channel your adrenaline.
So we've talked about legs and stance and breath, and now let's talk about eyes and the particular dilemma that we face as speakers involving making eye contact with listeners and how that eye contact is both essential because there's that sense of, can you look me in the eye and tell me that? But it's also a problem because it is eye contact that provokes, that actually is responsible for the adrenaline rush that we are experiencing. Let's first talk about that credibility issue. Listeners in the jury or a judge listening to you are focused where? They're focused right on your eyes. And therefore, it's so important to have that part of your anatomy under your conscious control because people are looking you in the eye. And there is, as a general proposition about credibility, that notion that you have to be able to look me in the eye and tell me that. So you need to be making eye contact with those jurors as you talk to them. Here's why it's difficult. Eye contact alone, according to scientific studies, is partly responsible for provoking the adrenaline rush. On the simplest level, it is the predator-prey response. There are more of them and there is only one of you. And there's a feeling very often when speaking to a jury or speaking to an audience that as people listen to you, they often have a demeanor that looks like this. And that flat affect in everyday conversation would have enormous meaning. If you came up to speak to me in conversation and I treated you to that demeanor, you got a question? You'd think, what's wrong with that guy? Why are you looking at me that way? So it's very important to understand that this is where we are looking, and you're looking at their faces, and to not be thrown by the fact that their faces are that kind of serious deadpan expression giving you nothing back, as they would naturally in conversation. So you need to keep looking them in the eye. And yet looking them in the eye provokes that adrenaline rush. In fact, there's a very interesting study that says that if your jury would do you the favor of actually putting on sunglasses, preventing the literal eye contact of my eyes being able to see your eyes because the jury is suddenly wearing sunglasses, I would have a much lower adrenal response because of those sunglasses. But your jury can't very well do you that favor. So you've got to make eye contact. But what do we really mean by eye contact? In other words, how long are you going to look at a given juror, or how long are you going to look at a given witness? Unlike one-on-one conversation where you would make very long eye contact over sustained seconds, if not minutes, you're trying to talk to a jury. Well, what do you do to make that kind of contact? How much do you look at each person? I think you need to look at each juror regularly for a relatively small amount of time. In other words, it's not the sustained eye contact if I will look at that one individual juror for 30 seconds and then I will move on to that individual juror. So exactly how much time you spend with them and making that kind of eye contact is a matter of personal choice and personal style. But there's some new research about what they're calling quiet eye training. And it has to do with training athletes who already know, of course, to keep your eye on the ball. But they've discovered that the more you can sustain that eye contact, the more the quieting, if you will, the sustaining of that eye contact instead of letting the eyes flit around, allows the brain to calm down. In fact, consider what I'm doing to my brain if I let my eyes flit around as I talk to you. And what I'm doing if my eyes go up to the ceiling and down to the floor and over to the wall and up to the ceiling, that the more my eyes flit around, the more I'm not only saying to you, my goodness, that man looks like he's confused because he's flitting all over the place, but I'm literally unfocusing my brain. Because my eyes have to randomly take in that there are lights on the ceiling, carpeting on the floors, ladders against the wall, and as my eyes move around, my brain has to somehow process and yet at the same time dismiss that. Well, in the courtroom, you want to be able to focus your eyes, to focus your brain, to quiet your eyes, to sustain that eye contact as long as is appropriate for talking to the jury or talking to that witness. So let's get control of those eyes before you say anything. When you stand up and you're planting the feet and taking the breath, let's focus those eyes. Once you've looked at your notes to take in what you want to say, get those eyes back off the notes and either look at the jury or focus on the witness, or if you're addressing a judge, to focus on that judge. But to say, if I focus my eyes, I will focus my brain much more effectively, can then allow you to cope with the fact that eye contact is essential and, frankly, not so easy. So focus your eyes.
Now you have some ideas about how you can channel adrenaline's energy and transfer it from performance anxiety into excitement. So talk to yourself and say this: I'm nervous, but that's good. It gives me the energy I need to perform and win. Say that.
Talk to yourself and say this: take 3 more deep breaths to calm down while sitting at council table. Say that.
Say this: don't say a word until I'm standing still and ready to talk.
To channel your adrenaline, get mindful control of your feet, your breath, and your eyes.